The night Ethan Carter saved Amelia Grant's life, he was holding a mop. No badge, no gun, no title. Just a gray uniform, a bucket of dirty water, and hands that had once pulled dying men out of burning buildings in places most people couldn't find on a map. The executives of Sterling Dynamics walked past him every single day without blinking. They saw a janitor, they saw nobody, they never saw the soldier. And when everything fell apart, when the woman running their company was ripped out of a parking garage by men who moved like ghosts, the only person who understood what had actually happened was the man emptying their trash cans. If this story already has you leaning forward, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to the channel right now and hit that notification bell, because we drop stories like this every week. And you do not want to miss what's coming. Smash that like button if you're staying until the end, and drop a comment below telling us your city and country. We want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The alarm on Ethan Carter's phone went off at 5:47 every morning, 13 minutes before it was supposed to. He never figured out why he always woke up early. Old habit, maybe. Or maybe his body had just forgotten how to sleep past a certain point, had gotten so used to snapping awake in the dark, already calculating, already listening, that rest had become something that happened to other people. He lay there for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling of his apartment, a two-bedroom unit on the fourth floor of a building where the elevator broke down twice a month and the hallway always smelled faintly of someone else's cooking. Not a bad smell, just present, just a reminder that the walls here were thin and life was close. Then he heard it, the small sound that made all the other sounds irrelevant. A little girl singing to herself in the next room. Off-key, completely unself-conscious, something she'd invented herself, because Sophie Carter did not sing other people's songs when she could make up her own. Ethan got up. He moved through the apartment quietly, muscle memory doing most of the work. Bathroom, then kitchen, hands already reaching for the pan before he'd fully decided what to make. Eggs. She liked scrambled, not runny, with a little too much cheese the way her mother used to make them. He'd figured that out by accident 8 months after Rachel died, when he'd overcooked a batch and Sophie had looked up at him and said, "These are better, Daddy." He hadn't cried. He just stood at the stove and breathed very carefully for a moment. That was 3 years ago. Sophie was 7 now. She came into the kitchen in mismatched socks, one with stars, one with a frog on the ankle, and climbed onto the bar stool without being asked, and started telling him about a dream she'd had involving a talking elevator and a very rude penguin. Ethan listened to every word. He asked follow-up questions. He did not check his phone. By 6:40, they were out the door, Sophie's backpack bouncing against her shoulders as they walked the 4 blocks to Linden Elementary. She held his hand for the first 2 blocks, and then let go without announcing it, the way kids do when they suddenly remember they're almost grown. He noticed, but didn't say anything, just shifted his hand to his jacket pocket and kept walking. At the school gate, she turned and looked up at him with those dark, serious eyes, Rachel's eyes, and said, "You're going to be late again." "I'm never late." "You were late last Tuesday." "I was exactly on time last Tuesday. Those are 2 different things." She gave him the look. 7 years old, and she already had a look. He'd spent 11 years as a Navy SEAL and 4 of them as a rescue team commander, and he had genuinely never been looked at like that by anyone until his daughter invented it specifically for him. "Go to school," he said. "Bye, Dad." She disappeared through the gate. He stood there an extra few seconds before turning back toward the bus stop. A habit, an irrational one. She was fine, she was inside, but he always waited those extra seconds. Sterling Dynamics occupied the top 18 floors of a 40-story glass tower in the financial district, and Ethan worked the night custodial shift, 7 p.m. to 3 a.m., 5 nights a week. He had held the position for going on 2 years. He was good at it, efficient, quiet, thorough. He showed up early and left late and never called in sick and never caused problems, which made him, in the eyes of the facility's supervisor, Carl Briggs, the best employee on the overnight crew and therefore the one most frequently assigned to the executive floors where the carpets were nicer and the work required someone who wouldn't knock things over or go through desk drawers. "You don't mind the quiet up there?" Carl had asked him once, early on. "No," Ethan said. Carl had nodded like that was a normal answer. It wasn't, entirely. Most people found the upper floors unsettling after hours. All that empty glass and fluorescent light, and the particular silence of a place that usually held hundreds of people and currently held none. But Ethan had spent nights in places significantly more unnerving than a corporate office tower. Silence didn't bother him. Silence was just information you hadn't organized yet. The other members of the night crew called him Carter. Most of them. Denny, the youngest one, a 22-year-old who was working his way through community college and spent his breaks watching YouTube on his phone, sometimes called him E, which Ethan didn't encourage but also didn't correct. There was Linda, who had been with the building for 9 years and moved through it like she owned it. There was Marcus, who was 60-something and played chess on a pocketboard during his lunch break, and once, when Ethan had sat across from him and moved a piece almost without thinking, had looked up with genuine surprise and said, "You play?" "I used to," Ethan said. He had learned chess in the Navy. Lots of waiting in that life. Lots of hours in forward operating bases and transport vehicles and holding positions where the options were either to sleep or to think or to find something to do with your hands that wasn't destroying things. He didn't tell Marcus that. He just played. Marcus won the first game, Ethan won the next 4. After that they played to a draw, every time, and Marcus seemed to find this deeply satisfying, so Ethan let it be. The thing about working the executive floors of Sterling Dynamics was that you learned things, not on purpose, not because you were looking, but when you're the person pushing a cart down a corridor at 11 p.m., invisible by design, moving through spaces that have been vacated and therefore unwatched. People forget to close things all the way. Forget to turn screens off. Leave documents on desks and voices on speakerphone and conversations half completed in conference rooms where the door didn't latch properly. Ethan was not a nosy person. He had spent too many years in environments where knowing less was often smarter than knowing more. But he was, constitutionally, a person who noticed things. It wasn't a choice. It was just how his brain had been wired, or rewired maybe, over years of work that required you to read a room in the time it took to cross it. He noticed that the third-floor assistant always left exactly 20 minutes before her scheduled end time, which meant she was padding her timesheets. He noticed that the VP of Marketing, a loud man named Gerald Haynes, kept a second phone in his desk drawer and stepped into the corridor to use it when he thought no one was around. He noticed that the recycling in the COO's office was consistently emptied before the other executive offices, which meant someone on the cleaning crew was making a special trip, and it wasn't him, and it wasn't Linda, so it was either Denny or it was someone he hadn't accounted for. These were not conclusions. They were just data points. Ethan filed them the way he filed everything, without deciding what they meant yet, without attaching more weight to them than they'd earned. He also noticed Amelia Grant. He'd seen her in person exactly 4 times before the night things changed. The first time was her first week in the building, when she'd apparently stayed past midnight reviewing financials, and had walked out of her office to find Ethan vacuuming the executive suite hallway. She'd startled slightly, people always startled when they forgot there was a night crew, and then recovered and said crisply, "Sorry, didn't see you there." "It's fine," Ethan said. She'd nodded once, gone back inside, closed the door. The second and third times were similar. Brief, incidental. She worked late often, which the day crew gossiped about. Apparently she'd only been CEO for 8 months, appointed after the previous executive had a health crisis, and she was running hard to prove something to someone, though nobody seemed to agree on who that someone was. The 4th time, she'd been on the phone in the hallway outside the executive kitchen, speaking in a voice pitched low enough that she clearly wasn't expecting to be overheard, and Ethan had come around the corner with his cart, and they'd almost collided, and she'd looked up mid-sentence and said into the phone, "Hold on," and looked at him with eyes that were doing something complicated. Not anger, not irritation, something more like she was making a calculation she hadn't expected to have to make. "You're here late," he said, because it seemed like a normal thing to say. "I'm always here late," she said, and went back to her call. He kept moving. But he'd caught 2 words before he turned the corner, just fragments, the contracts, and someone I trust, and they'd filed themselves away without him choosing to keep them. The night it started, it was a Thursday in mid-November. Ethan had been in the building since 6:50, signing in early like usual, getting his assignment from Carl, loading his cart. He'd worked the 14th through 16th floors first, then the executive suite on 17, then taken the service elevator down to deal with the common spaces, lobby, break rooms, the long corridor that ran behind the conference center. By 11:30, he was in the parking structure. Technically, that was Marcus's territory, but Marcus had gone home early, stomach trouble, and Ethan had volunteered to cover it, partly because he didn't mind, and partly because there was a corner of the second sublevel where someone had been dumping coffee cups for 3 straight weeks, and it was starting to bother him. He took the service stairs down. The parking structure under Sterling Dynamics was 4 levels deep, gray concrete and yellow painted lines, and the particular smell of oil and exhaust that seeped into everything. It was almost entirely empty at this hour. A handful of cars belonging to people still working upstairs, including Amelia Grant's black sedan near the elevator bank. He noted it without attaching anything to it. She worked late. Her car was here. That was unremarkable. He found the coffee cups, cleaned them, worked his way through the second sublevel, methodical, the sound of his cart's wheels bouncing off the concrete in a rhythm he'd stopped hearing weeks ago. Then he stopped, because something was different. He couldn't have said immediately what it was, just that the texture of the space had shifted. Some quality of the silence, some small wrongness that had no name yet. He stood still and let his eyes move rather than his body, the way he'd been trained to, the way that kind of training never fully leaves you regardless of how many years you spend pretending it has. There. The security camera at the northeast corner of the second sublevel, the one covering the ramp between B2 and B3, was angled wrong. Just slightly. Maybe 3 degrees off its usual position, which wouldn't register unless you'd been looking at it for 2 years and had, without intending to, memorized its angle the way you memorize where a picture hangs on your wall. He moved toward it slowly, keeping the cart between himself and the direction the camera should have been pointing. Up close, he saw what someone in a hurry might have missed. A small smear of something dark on the mounting bracket. Not grease. The color was wrong, and the housing had a hairline crack along one edge, the kind you'd get if someone had physically adjusted it, quickly, with more force than care. Someone had moved the camera, on purpose, recently. He crouched down next to the base of a concrete pillar and looked at the floor. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to find, but what he found was a set of tire marks, the faint impression of tread against a patch of dust near the ramp entrance. And the marks weren't from any of the cars parked on this level. The turning radius was wrong. Whatever had made these marks had come down the ramp, turned hard, and gone back up, and it had done it without lights, because he would have seen the reflection. He stood up. His heart rate was steady. That was something he noticed about himself sometimes. When things were genuinely wrong, the noise in his head got quieter rather than louder. Some backward switch that had been installed in him during years of bad situations. He pulled out his phone and called the building's security desk. A man named Gary answered on the third ring, which was already a problem. Security. This is Carter, night custodial. I'm on B2. I need someone down here to look at something. What kind of something? Camera's been repositioned. There are tire marks from an unregistered vehicle. I think someone's been down here tonight. A pause. Carter, the parking structure doesn't log activity after. I know what it logs. I'm looking at physical evidence. Someone was here. Another pause. Longer. Ethan heard Gary shift in his chair. I'll send a note to the morning team. I'm not asking you to send a note to the morning team. I'm asking you to come look at this right now. Look, man, I've got the whole building to watch. If you want to write an incident report. Ethan ended the call. He stood in the gray light of the parking structure and looked at the tire marks and the moved camera and the smear on the bracket, and something cold moved through his chest. Not fear. Not exactly. More like recognition. He pulled the cart to the side, took out his personal flashlight. He carried one because the building's work lights were inconsistent, and he'd learned not to rely on infrastructure, and crouched next to the marks again. There. At the base of the ramp, almost invisible against the concrete, a small piece of black nylon webbing, maybe 3 inches long, the kind used in tactical gear, in load-bearing vests, in the sort of equipment that did not belong in a corporate parking structure. He picked it up and held it in the light. The cold thing in his chest got colder. He thought about Amelia Grant's car by the elevator bank. He thought about the 2 words he'd caught from her phone call, the contracts and someone I trust. He thought about the tire marks and the disabled camera and the piece of webbing in his hand and the 3 or 4 different ways these things could connect. And only one of those ways led anywhere good. Then he heard, from somewhere below him, faint, distorted by concrete, what might have been a door or what might have been something else. He stood up. He left the cart where it was. He moved to the ramp and went down. Whoa. The third sublevel was darker. Two of the overhead lights were out, which they hadn't been last week. He knew, because he'd flagged them for the maintenance team, and they hadn't been fixed yet, and he'd made a mental note to escalate it. And now standing here, he understood that maybe that had not been an oversight. He moved along the wall, keeping his profile narrow, the flashlight off. It took him 40 seconds to reach the far end of the level. What he found there was a white panel van, engine off, no plates, parked against the back wall in the one corner that the functioning cameras on B3 wouldn't reach from any angle. Whoever had positioned it there had known exactly where those cameras pointed. The van was empty. Its rear doors were open. On the floor of the van, barely visible in the ambient light from the ramp, were two things. A phone, cracked, that was not Amelia Grant's model, but could have been dropped in a struggle, and a single high-heeled shoe. Black, small. The kind worn by someone who'd been planning on walking out of the building under their own power. Ethan stood there looking at it. He reached for his phone. This time, he didn't call building security. He called 911, and when the dispatcher answered, he spoke clearly and without decoration. A woman appeared to have been taken from the parking structure of Sterling Dynamics. There was a vehicle used in the extraction. He had evidence of camera tampering, and he needed police here within the next 10 minutes because whoever had done this had moved efficiently and had a head start, and every minute they waited made a difference. The dispatcher asked him to stay on the line. He did, but while he stayed on the line, he walked slowly back to where the tire marks were and crouched down and studied them again in the flashlight beam. The tread pattern, the depth, the turning arc, military vehicle. Converted for civilian use, probably, but military base. He could tell from the width and the axle spacing and the particular way the front tires had cut the turn, too aggressive for civilian driving habits, the kind of aggressive you learned in a specific kind of training. These people were not random. They had planned this, scouted the location, neutralized the cameras, timed their exit, used trained drivers. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was an operation. When the police arrived 11 minutes later, 7 minutes past what he'd asked for, Ethan was standing at the ramp entrance with the piece of nylon webbing in a folded piece of paper to preserve whatever it might hold, the cracked phone photographed from 4 angles, and a diagram he'd sketched on a maintenance request form showing the camera positions, the van's location, and the probable route of entry and exit. The first officer, a young man named Reyes, looked at the diagram and looked at Ethan and looked at the diagram again. "You put this together since you called?" "I've been down here for a while," Ethan said. The exit route was through the west ramp to the service alley. They had a window of about 4 minutes between camera rotations, so they're probably already outside a 2-mile radius. Reyes stared at him. "I'm the janitor," Ethan said, preempting the question. "I clean the building." "Right," Reyes said slowly, in the tone of someone deciding not to pursue a particular line of thought right now. "Okay. Sir, I need you to wait here for my sergeant." "I'll wait," Ethan said. He waited. He thought about Sophie at home, asleep in her room with the stars. And frog-mismatched socks probably still on her feet because she always fell asleep before she remembered to take them off. He thought about the shoe on the floor of the van. He thought about a woman who worked too late and spoke too quietly on her phone about contracts and trust, and who was, right now, somewhere in the city that she had not chosen to be. He thought about a lot of things while he stood at the bottom of the parking ramp and waited for a sergeant who would look at him the same way Reyes had looked at him. Just a janitor. That was fine. He'd been looked at like that before. It didn't change what he'd seen, or what he knew, or what was quietly, without announcement, beginning to wake up inside him. Something he'd kept in a box in the back of a closet for 3 years, wrapped in old cloth, placed where he wouldn't have to look at it. Not gone. Never gone. Just waiting. Sergeant Carol Wynn arrived at B3 at 12:41 in the morning, which was exactly 31 minutes after Ethan had called 911, and she walked into the situation the same way she walked into all of them, scanning, filing, deciding. And when she got to Ethan, she did the same thing Reyes had done, which was look at him and then look at the diagram, and then look at him again. "You drew this," she said. It wasn't really a question. "Yes." "From memory." "I was standing here when I figured it out. It wasn't from memory. I was looking at what's actually here." Wynn studied the diagram for another few seconds. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, compact, with the kind of tired in her face that came from years of the job rather than a single bad night. She didn't seem annoyed by him exactly, but she had the practiced flatness of someone who'd learned to run everything through a filter before reacting. "You work here," she said. "Night custodial, 2 years. And you know enough about camera rotation schedules to figure out a 4-minute window." "I know the building," Ethan said. "I've been cleaning it for 2 years. You pay attention long enough, you learn the systems." She looked at him a moment longer than felt comfortable. Then she turned to Reyes and said, "Get the van photographed and bagged before anyone else touches it. I want the shoe in evidence." Back to Ethan. "You stay available. I'm going to have more questions." "I know," he said. He spent the next 40 minutes sitting on a concrete barrier near the ramp entrance while the crime scene team worked around him. He answered the questions they asked him and didn't volunteer more than they asked for, which was its own kind of discipline. There were things he'd noticed that he wasn't ready to share until he understood better who he was sharing them with and what they'd do with it. The piece of nylon webbing he'd already turned over to Reyes. The photograph he'd taken of the tire marks he'd sent to his own email before handing over the phone to be logged as evidence. He told himself it was just being careful. He tried not to look too hard at what it actually was. The official position of the Sterling Dynamics Security Team, delivered to Sergeant Wynne just after 1 in the morning by a man named Patrick Holt, head of corporate security, suit and tie at 1 a.m., which was its own kind of statement, was that Amelia Grant had likely left the building voluntarily. "Her calendar shows a personal appointment this evening," Holt said, standing near the van with his arms crossed in a way that managed to be simultaneously defensive and authoritative. "We have no confirmed evidence of a struggle." "We have a shoe," Wynne said. "We have a shoe one, which doesn't tell us anything definitive. It tells me she didn't walk out of here on purpose." Holt made a sound that was almost diplomatic. "Ms. Grant has been under considerable professional stress. It's possible she stepped out for personal reasons, and her phone was damaged incidentally." "Her car is still parked on B2, Ethan said. Both of them looked at him. He hadn't been invited into the conversation. He was standing 6 feet away, which was close enough to hear everything and far enough to pretend he wasn't listening. "Her car is still here," he said again, keeping his voice level. The van came and went without registration plates. The camera on the northeast corner was physically repositioned before the window opened, and whoever drove that van knew exactly which corner of this level wasn't covered. That's not a personal appointment gone sideways. That's a planned extraction. Holt looked at him the way certain people looked at him. Not with contempt exactly, but with the particular blankness that appeared when someone decided they were done processing information from a source they'd already categorized. "And you are Carter, night crew." Ethan didn't expand on it. Holt turned back to Wynne. "I'll have our internal team pull the full camera archive for the last 72 hours. If there's anything relevant, we'll cooperate fully." Wynne said, "We'll need that archive pulled by our team, not yours." A small pause. "Of course," Holt said, in the tone of a man who had already decided what would and wouldn't be in the archive by the time anyone looked. Ethan noted that too, so. Hannah got home at 3:20. Sophie was asleep, socks still on. He stood in her doorway for a moment, one hand on the frame, and watched her breathe. Then he went to the kitchen and sat at the table with a glass of water he didn't drink, and stayed there until 4:15, when he finally went to bed. He slept 2 hours. Maybe less. In the morning, he made Sophie's eggs with too much cheese and walked her to school and stood at the gate and watched her disappear, and then went home and opened his laptop. He told himself he was just looking into it. Background, context, the kind of thing you did when something didn't sit right and you had to understand it better before you could let it go. He pulled up everything publicly available on Sterling Dynamics. Annual reports, press releases. The industry coverage that ran whenever Amelia Grant did something noteworthy, which was often enough that there was a decent trail. She'd been appointed CEO 8 months ago after a man named Warren Steele had stepped down following a cardiac event. Before that, she'd been CFO for 3 years. Before that, Director of Financial Strategy. She'd grown up inside the company, almost. She knew its structures and its numbers better than anyone, which made her, he thought, precisely the kind of person who would notice if the numbers were wrong. He dug further. Into the company's recent financial filings, the ones available through public regulatory databases. He wasn't an accountant. He had no formal training in reading corporate financials. But he'd spent enough time in operational environments where money moved in complicated ways for complicated reasons that he knew what certain patterns looked like. He found 3 of them in the last 6 months. Contracts listed with vendors he couldn't verify. Amounts that were large enough to be significant, but structured in a way spread across subsidiaries and billing cycles that kept any individual transaction below obvious scrutiny thresholds. And one consistent name appearing in the authorization chain, 3 levels below where most people would think to look. Connor Blake, Chief Operating Officer. He wrote the name down on a piece of paper because writing things down made them real in a different way than seeing them on a screen. Then he sat back and thought about what that meant. By mid-morning, the city was covering the story. Not prominently. It made page 8 of the online edition of the city paper. A brief item about the CEO of a mid-sized technology firm reported missing after an apparent incident at her office building. No details about the parking structure. No mention of the van. Ethan read the item twice and then looked up Connor Blake. The public profile was clean. 15 years at Sterling Dynamics, steady advancement, no controversies in the press. He had an MBA from a program Ethan didn't recognize, and a LinkedIn profile with a professional headshot and a long list of connections. He gave a quote in almost every Sterling Dynamics press release, usually something about operational excellence or strategic growth. The photo was the thing that held Ethan's attention. He looked at it for a long time, dark hair going gray at the temples, a very controlled smile, the kind of face that had learned, a long time ago, how to show exactly what it meant to show and nothing else. Ethan had known men like that, had worked alongside them and occasionally worked against them, in contexts that didn't make it into any official record. A face that controlled itself too well was sometimes just a private person, and sometimes it was something else. He couldn't know which this was. Not yet. What he knew was that Connor Blake had authorization on contracts that didn't add up, that those contracts had been structured to avoid scrutiny, and that the woman who would have been best positioned to catch the pattern was now missing from a parking structure where someone had gone to significant effort to create a clean extraction window. He wrote that down too. Then he called Sergeant Wynne. Oh, she didn't answer. He left a message. He had some information about the company's recent financial structure that might be relevant, and he'd appreciate a callback. She called back 6 hours later. What kind of information? She said without preamble. Contracts authorized through the COO's office that don't appear to have legitimate vendor backing. 3 separate instances in the last 6 months. The amounts are significant. A pause. And you found this how? Public financial filings. Nothing proprietary. Another pause. Longer. You cleaned offices. Now you're reading corporate financial statements. I read a lot of things, Ethan said. Do you want the information or not? She wanted it. He could tell by the quality of the silence. Come in tomorrow morning, she said. Ask for me at the front desk. He went in the next morning. He brought the paper he'd written on and a folder of printed pages he'd organized the night before after Sophie went to sleep. Wynne sat across from him in a small interview room that smelled like burnt coffee and looked at everything he'd put in front of her with careful, methodical attention. When she was done, she looked up. You said the van's tire pattern indicated military training, she said. I said it was consistent with that. The turning technique, the way the front wheels cut the angle on the ramp, that's not something most civilian drivers do. It's aggressive and it's precise. You learn it in a specific kind of training environment. What kind of training environment would that be? The kind where it matters that you don't lose time on a turn. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him differently than she had the night before. Not hostile, not open exactly. More like she'd upgraded the quality of her attention, which was its own thing. Where are you from, Carter? She said. Originally, Ohio. That's not what I'm asking. He looked at her steadily. I know what you're asking. She let it sit there. Outside the small room, the precinct moved around them. Phones, voices, the sound of a door swinging open somewhere down the hall. The COO, she said finally. You think he's involved? I think the pattern fits. And I think whoever planned the extraction from that parking structure had access to the building's security architecture, which is not information you get from outside. Somebody on the inside. Somebody on the inside who had both motive and access, Ethan said, which narrows it. Wynne tapped one finger on the folder. I need to share this with the task force. They're taking the lead on the missing persons element. I understand. That means more people are going to look at how you put this together. That's fine, he said. She studied him. Is it? Yes, he said. Do what you need to do with it. That's why I brought it to you. He meant it. That part was simple enough. What he did with what came after, that was less certain. But getting the information into the right hands was a clean step. He could do clean steps. The task force had a lead investigator named Voss. Marcus Voss, federal credentials, mid-50s, the kind of bearing that had once been military and had been smoothed over by 15 years of federal work without ever quite disappearing. He interviewed Ethan on the third day in a conference room at a federal building downtown and spent the first 20 minutes trying to figure out where Ethan fit. You noticed the camera repositioning, he said. Yes. During your normal rounds, yes. And you were in the third sublevel because I was covering for a colleague who went home sick. I'd been meaning to address a trash situation in that corner for a few weeks. Voss wrote something. He had a legal pad and an actual pen, which Ethan respected slightly. How long did it take you to reconstruct the sequence of events down there? A few minutes. A few minutes, Voss repeated, in the tone of a man who was deciding how to file something. You're saying you walked into that parking structure and in a few minutes figured out that a planned extraction had taken place, where the vehicle had been staged, what the camera blind spots were, and how long the team had to work. I was looking at evidence that was there. I wasn't guessing. No, Voss said slowly. That's what I'm noticing. He put the pen down. Mr. Carter, you work the night custodial shift at a corporate office building. You have no listed prior law enforcement or investigative background. And yet in the last 3 days, you've produced a physical evidence analysis, a financial discrepancy profile on the company's COO, and a tactical breakdown of the extraction method that my team, between them, a combined 80 years of experience, did not have until you walked through the door. He paused. Help me understand that. I pay attention, Ethan said. Voss looked at him without expression for a long moment. Okay, he said. Sure. He moved on. But the way he moved on, the particular careful neutrality of it, told Ethan that Voss was not done with the question. He was just filing it for later. On the fourth day, the thing Ethan had been half expecting happened. He was at home, eating cereal at the kitchen table at 7 in the morning while Sophie slept. She didn't have school on Fridays that week, some kind of teacher development day, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Carter, a woman's voice. Professional, precise, the kind of voice that belonged to someone accustomed to being heard clearly the first time. My name is Diana Foster. I'm with Federal Investigations, attached to the Sterling Dynamics Task Force. I'd like to meet with you today if you're available. What time? He said. Whenever works for you. That was interesting. People who ran investigations didn't usually defer on scheduling unless they were trying to put you at ease, which meant they either needed something specific from you or they were concerned that the direct approach would make you defensive. 11, he said. There's a diner on Caldwell, near the 3rd Street intersection. It's called Marcy's. A pause. That works. I'll see you there. He told Sophie he had an errand to run. He asked Linda from the building if she could sit with Sophie for a couple of hours, which Linda agreed to with the easy generosity she extended to everything, and he walked the 12 blocks to Marcy's because the walk gave him time to think. Diana Foster was already there when he arrived, which told him she'd gone early to get the lay of the space. She had a coffee in front of her and nothing else on the table. She was somewhere around his age, maybe a year or two younger, with close-cropped hair and the kind of stillness that came from practice rather than personality. She watched him come through the door and crossed to the table without shifting her posture. They shook hands. He sat down. The server came and he ordered coffee, and she waited until it arrived before she spoke. I've been looking at your work, she said. The evidence analysis, the financial summary. It's good. Thank you. I mean it as a genuine observation, not a compliment. It's genuinely good, and it doesn't fit the profile we have for you. She folded her hands on the table. So I want to ask you directly, because I think you'll appreciate that more than the other approach. What's the other approach? Running your background harder until something comes up, which takes time we may not have. She looked at him steadily. Who are you, Mr. Carter? He looked back at her. Outside the diner window, Caldwell Street moved through its morning meb. People walking to work, a delivery truck double parked, a kid on a bike weaving through a gap in traffic that was maybe a little too narrow. He'd known this conversation was coming, had been running through how to handle it since the third day, when Voss's careful neutrality told him that the wrong people were asking the right questions. The thing about burying an identity is that you could do it effectively for a long time if you were careful, and if nobody was specifically motivated to dig. He'd been careful. He'd built a paper trail that was thin but credible. A man who'd moved around, worked odd jobs, settled into something stable after becoming a single father. Nothing that invited scrutiny, nothing that flagged anything. But there was nothing to do about the things you couldn't change, the way you moved, the way you analyzed a scene, the way your brain organized information when something was wrong. Those things didn't go in a box. "My daughter's 7, he said. "Her name is Sophie. Her mother died 3 years ago." He picked up his coffee. "That's who I am." Foster was quiet for a moment. "And before that?" "Before that, I was someone else." "How someone else?" He put the coffee down. "Military, special operations. More than that isn't something I'm going to give you in a diner over coffee, so let's talk about what's actually useful. You said you don't have time to run my background harder. What does that mean? What's the timeline?" She watched him for another beat. Then she seemed to make a decision, the same kind of decision he recognized because he made them the same way. Not a softening, but a recalibration. "We have a potential location. We're not certain yet. We're still triangulating. But the cell data from the phone found in the van suggests a staging point roughly 40 miles north of the city, near an area with some old industrial facilities." "Mason Ridge," Ethan said. Her expression shifted, just slightly. "Where did you hear that?" "I didn't, I'm telling you." He'd spent 2 nights going through satellite maps of the 40-mile radius north of the city, cross-referencing abandoned industrial sites with the logistics requirements for holding someone securely, and the road access patterns that would fit the van's estimated fuel load and direction of travel. Mason Ridge was the only site that fit all 3 criteria. Decommissioned military repair facility, converted to private industrial use in the late 90s, and then abandoned after the company folded. 4 buildings, partial underground infrastructure, road access from 2 directions, nearest active property more than a mile and a half away. Foster stared at him. "It fits," he said. "Mr. Carter. If you're going in there, you need to know that the underground infrastructure changes the tactical picture significantly. You can't treat it as a standard facility entry. There are choke points in those access corridors that can be controlled by a small number of people very effectively." He paused. "I'm not telling you how to run your operation. I'm giving you information that's relevant." She was very still. "How do you know about the underground infrastructure?" "The original construction records are in the county planning database. They're public. I pulled them yesterday." She looked at him for a long moment. Her coffee had gone cool, and she hadn't touched it. "I need to know who I'm working with," she said finally. "Not for paperwork. Because if this goes to Mason Ridge, I need to know whether the person I'm bringing information from is someone I can trust when it matters." It was a fair thing to say. It was the right thing to say, actually, and he gave her credit for saying it directly. "I need a couple of days," he said. "There are some things I have to handle first." She nodded slowly. "We may not have a couple of days." "I know." He stood up and left money on the table for the coffee. "I'll be in touch." He walked home faster than he'd walked to the diner. Sophie was in the living room with Linda, working on a drawing, some elaborate architectural thing involving towers and what appeared to be a waterfall system. And she looked up when he came in and said, "Linda taught me how to make a drawbridge, with the specific pride of someone who has just acquired a crucial piece of knowledge." "That's useful," Ethan said. "It's for defense," Sophie explained seriously. "If someone comes to your castle and you don't want them there, you can raise it up and they can't get in." "Smart," he said. Linda caught his eye over Sophie's head. He gave her a small nod that said, "I'm fine," and she gave him one back that said, "I know you'd say that regardless," and then excused herself and left them. He sat on the floor next to Sophie and looked at her drawing for a while. The towers were crooked and the drawbridge mechanism was physically implausible, and it was, without question, a very good drawing. "Dad," Sophie said, not looking up from her work, "is everything okay?" "Yes," he said. She considered that. You look like the way you looked when the refrigerator made that noise and you were trying to figure out what it was. That's a very specific look. It's your problem-solving face. She added a turret to one of the towers. Are you trying to figure something out? Yeah, he said. I am. Is it something you can fix? He looked at his daughter. At the top of her head bent over her paper, the part in her hair slightly crooked, the faint smear of orange marker on her left wrist that she either hadn't noticed or had decided to keep as a design feature. He thought about Amelia Grant, somewhere inside an abandoned facility 40 miles north, and about a shoe on the floor of a van, and about a man named Connor Blake, who had very carefully learned how to show the world exactly the face he wanted it to see. He thought about a box in the back of his closet. Yeah, he said quietly. I think I can. Sophie nodded, satisfied, and went back to her drawbridge. He sat next to her on the floor and watched her work, and inside his chest something that had been wound very tight for 3 years was slowly, with the particular reluctance of a thing that knows what unwinding means, beginning to move. The box was on the top shelf of his bedroom closet, behind a winter jacket he hadn't worn in 2 years, and a shoebox full of Sophie's drawings from when she was 4, the ones with the enormous round heads and stick arms that she'd presented to him with the gravity of a serious artist presenting serious work. He'd put the box there deliberately. Not hidden, exactly. Just placed where the daily business of living wouldn't bring him into accidental contact with it. He had to reach for it, and reaching for it would always be a choice rather than an accident. He reached for it now. It was heavier than he remembered. Or maybe he remembered it exactly, and the weight was just different now that he was lifting it on purpose, which was its own kind of physics. He set it on the bed and stood looking at it for a moment. Gray, plastic, the latch slightly corroded from years in a storage unit before this closet. Not dramatic, just a box. He opened it. The metals were at the bottom, wrapped in cloth the way you'd wrap something fragile, which they weren't. They were metal, and they'd outlast everything. But he'd wrap them anyway, because wrapping them meant not having to look at them every time he opened the thing. On top of them was a folded document that he didn't unfold. A photograph he also didn't look at directly, just registered in his peripheral vision. 5 men in tactical gear in a location he could identify by the light quality and the vegetation even without looking closely, which meant he still knew it better than he wanted to. He moved those things aside. What he was looking for was underneath all of it. A slim folder, water-stained at one corner, containing the operational records he'd been allowed to keep, the declassified portions, which were thinner than the full record by about 90%, but still represented the shape of things. Names, dates, locations rendered in the bureaucratic shorthand of military documentation that managed to make catastrophe sound like a procedural discrepancy. He took the folder to the kitchen table, made coffee he didn't want, sat down. The operation had been called Cross Harbor. 8 years ago. A hostage recovery mission in a location he still wasn't going to name, even in his own head, because the habit of not naming it was the kind of habit that persisted. His team had been 6 operators plus him. They'd had good intelligence, or thought they had, about the target location, the number of guards, the access points, the timing. The intelligence had been wrong, not because the intelligence collectors had failed, because someone had fed them false information, and that false information had been seeded so carefully into the legitimate data stream that it had passed every verification check his team ran before going in. They'd walked into a prepared position. 2 of his men had not walked out. The investigation afterward had identified a leak in the operational chain, someone who'd had access to the mission profile and had passed it to the opposing party. The investigation had not officially identified who that person was. The file had been closed with a finding of probable but unconfirmed external compromise. Ethan had spent 3 years after Cross Harbor trying to find the answer the official investigation hadn't provided. He'd done it quietly, on his own time, through channels that were adjacent to official ones without quite being inside them. And he'd gotten close enough to identify a shape, not a name exactly, but a direction. A contractor who'd had access. A payment trail that had been designed to be invisible but wasn't, quite, if you knew what invisible payment trails looked like in that context. The contractor's name was Hunter Davis. He sat with that name for a moment. He'd had it for 2 years before he left the service. Had passed it to 2 people he trusted, both of whom had told him the evidence wasn't solid enough to pursue officially and that he should let it go before he made enemies he didn't need. He'd let it go. Or he'd tried to. He'd gotten out, and then Rachel had gotten sick, and then Rachel had died. And by the time he'd resurfaced from that particular devastation, he'd been in a different life entirely. An apartment with thin walls and a daughter with mismatched socks and a night janitor job in a glass tower downtown. Hunter Davis had become a thing he'd filed under unresolved and tried to leave there. Now he sat at his kitchen table at 9 in the morning, looking at a water-stained folder and thinking about the nylon webbing he'd picked up off the floor of a parking structure, and about what Diana Foster had said about the tactical execution of Amelia Grant's kidnapping, and about the particular way the van driver had cut that ramp turn. He thought, it can't be. Then he thought, but if it is? He got up and refilled his coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at the street below. A woman was walking a dog that didn't want to walk. It had sat down on the sidewalk and was doing the thing where it became 90% dead weight, and the leash went taut, and she was standing there with her hands on her hips, having what appeared to be a negotiation with an animal that had already decided it was done for the morning. He watched them for a minute. Then he called Diana Foster. She answered on the second ring. I'm ready to talk, he said. Properly. All of it. A brief pause. When? Now, if you can manage it. She came to his apartment, which was her idea and which he didn't object to. She arrived 40 minutes after his call, and he buzzed her up and she came in and stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at the folder on the table and the box from the bedroom that he'd left open on the counter because there was no point closing it now. Sit down, he said. Coffee? Please. He poured 2 cups and sat across from her. She sat the way she always seemed to sit, straight without being stiff, hands loose, the quality of waiting that didn't leak impatience around the edges. He respected that about her. A lot of people in federal work had a performance they did, a way of occupying a room that was about authority or efficiency or projecting something. Foster just occupied the room. He told her. Not everything. There were things that were still classified and he knew exactly where those lines were, but everything that was relevant. The shape of his service record, the rank, the unit type, the broad parameters of the work. Cross Harbor. The 2 men who hadn't come out. The investigation that had closed without resolution and what he'd found in the 2 years he'd spent looking after the official investigation stopped. Hunter Davis. She listened without interrupting, which was harder than it sounded. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, How confident are you in the Davis identification? 75%. I never got it to a provable threshold. That's why I stopped. What would move it past 75? Physical evidence connecting him to the payment trail I found, or testimony from someone inside the contracting network who could confirm the access timeline. He paused. Or him showing up attached to a planned extraction operation using the exact tactical signature I traced back to him 8 years ago. She looked at him steadily. The van. The camera positioning, the window timing, the way the extraction was structured to allow for a small team and a clean exit. It's the same methodology. He put both hands flat on the table. I'm not saying it's definitely him. I'm saying the signature is the same, and I want you to know that before anyone goes near Mason Ridge. Foster pulled out her phone and looked at something on it, then set it face down on the table. We ran the nylon webbing from the parking structure through the lab. It's consistent with load-bearing equipment produced by a specific defense contractor. That contractor's products are sold commercially, but the primary market is private security firms and military contractors. Not inconsistent with Davis, Ethan said. No, not inconsistent. She picked up her coffee. There's something else. We ran the financial records you flagged, the Blake contracts. Our forensic accounting team confirmed the pattern you identified. Vendors that don't exist, shell structures. The money's moving through at least 4 layers, but the destination is offshore accounts tied to a private security operation. Whose operation? She looked at him across the table. That's what we're still tracing, but the operational structure of the private security firm, the way it's registered, the way it hires, it's consistent with how former special operations personnel structure private contracting operations. Ethan nodded slowly. Blake provided the inside access. Davis provided the operational capability. That's the working theory. She paused. which means Amelia Grant didn't walk into a random criminal kidnapping. She walked into something that was specifically designed, financed, and executed by people who knew exactly what they were doing and had a very clear end goal. Which is what, exactly? She'd been compiling evidence against Blake for approximately 6 weeks before the kidnapping. Our investigators found an encrypted drive in her office. She'd been building a case. Contracts, communications, financial records she'd pulled quietly. She was 3 days from taking it to the board. Foster set her coffee cup down. Blake needed to stop that, and he needed system access that only she could provide. Her executive credentials would have given whoever used them complete authority over Sterling Dynamics classified data infrastructure, financial records, client contracts, proprietary technology files. So the plan was never just to remove her, Ethan said. It was to extract the credentials first, and then remove her, Foster confirmed. Yes. The apartment was quiet. From down the hall he could hear the faint sound of Sophie's tablet. She was watching something, some cartoon she'd cycled through so many times she'd started narrating along with it. The sound of it was so ordinary against everything else he was sitting with that it created a kind of doubling effect, the two realities existing in the same space without reconciling. I need to be part of the Mason Ridge operation, he said. I know, Foster said. She didn't say it like a concession. She said it like something she'd already decided on the walk over. That's going to require explaining me to Voss. I've already started that conversation. She stood up and picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. I need you to come in this afternoon and put your full record on the table. Not for me, I believe you. For the people who'll need to sign off on your involvement. Understood. One more thing. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. If Hunter Davis is at Mason Ridge, if it's actually him, she paused, choosing the phrasing carefully. Is that a problem for you? He knew what she was asking, whether the history would compromise his judgment, whether he'd walk into that building carrying 8 years of guilt and a need to settle something that had nothing to do with the woman they were trying to retrieve. It was a fair question, the most important question she'd asked. No, he said. It's not a problem. She held his gaze for one more second, then nodded and left. He sat at the table after she was gone and finished his coffee and thought about whether the answer he'd given her was true. He decided it was, mostly. Mostly was enough, he thought. Mostly was what everyone operated on. The briefing that afternoon was in a conference room on the 7th floor of the federal building, and there were 6 people in it. Voss, Foster, 2 analysts he didn't know, a woman introduced as Deputy Director Chow who appeared to be there specifically to assess him, and a former colleague of Ethan's who walked in 5 minutes late and stopped in the doorway when he saw him and said, "Well, I'll be damned." His name was Ray Kowalski. He'd been a SEAL long enough to have worked alongside Ethan's unit on 2 separate occasions, and he'd moved into federal tactical consulting years ago. He was heavier than Ethan remembered, grayer, with the same particular competence that certain people carried in their physicality. You could tell by how they stood and moved that they had extensive experience with situations where standing and moving incorrectly ended things badly. "You've been cleaning offices," Kowalski said, sitting down across from him. "Yes." "For 2 years." "Yes." Kowalski looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who had many questions and had decided this was not the moment for them. "Okay," he said. "Okay," and opened his folder. The briefing proceeded. Ethan laid out his record, the parts he could lay out, and watched the room's posture shift as the picture clarified. Voss, to his credit, did not make a show of having suspected something was off. He just absorbed the information and integrated it and moved forward, which was what good investigators did. Deputy Director Chow asked 3 questions. They were precise and well-chosen, and each of them was designed to test something specific: his operational reliability, his potential personal conflicts, and his capacity to function inside a chain of command he hadn't chosen. He answered all 3 honestly, including the honest answer to the second one, which was that Davis being potentially present was a complicating factor that he was aware of and had thought through. "The complication is manageable," he said. "I've had 8 years to process it. My priority is Grant. Davis is secondary." Chow looked at him. Then she wrote something on the pad in front of her and moved on. At the end of the briefing, when the logistics of the Mason Ridge approach were being mapped, entry points, team structure, communications, contingencies, Voss turned to Ethan and said, without preamble, "The underground infrastructure. Walk us through it." Ethan walked them through it. He'd memorized the county planning records. He put it on the whiteboard in sections, the layout of the access corridors, the choke points, the probable locations for holding someone if you were trying to maintain control and limit your own exposure. He marked 3 spots where a small defensive team could control the corridor access almost indefinitely with the right positioning. If Davis planned the facility use, he said, he knows all of this. He's going to have those positions covered. "So we don't go through the corridors," one of the analysts said. "Not the obvious ones. There's a secondary access point here." He marked the board, that the original construction records show as a utility corridor. It doesn't appear in the simplified facility maps that would have been available to anyone doing a quick site assessment. If Davis did his homework from public sources rather than the original engineering records, he may not know it exists. Kowalski leaned forward. May not, Ethan confirmed. "I'm not going to tell you it's certain. It's an advantage that might be there. We plan for the possibility that it isn't." Voss nodded slowly. "We'll structure around both scenarios." I was home by 7. He made dinner. Pasta. Nothing complicated. The kind of meal that required enough attention to keep his hands busy without requiring enough attention to crowd out everything else. Sophie sat at the counter and told him about the drawbridge improvement she'd made to her drawing, which now apparently included a moat, and he listened and stirred and thought about a facility 40 miles north. "Dad?" Sophie said. "Yeah." "Are you going somewhere?" He looked up from the pot. She was watching him with that direct, undeflected gaze that she'd had since she was an infant. Rachel used to say Sophie came out of the womb already suspicious of anything she hadn't personally verified. "Maybe," he said, "for a short time, a day or 2. "For work?" He thought about the right answer. Not about what to conceal. He was generally a straight talker with her, adjusted for age, but about how to frame something that was true. "There's a person who needs help," he said, "and I'm one of the people who might be able to help her." Sophie considered this. "A her?" "Yes." "Is she nice?" "I don't know her very well, but she's in trouble, and it's not her fault, and she deserves to have someone try." His daughter was quiet for a moment. Her feet were swinging from the bar stool in the irregular rhythm they always swung in. Not a beat, just movement, the physical overflow of a brain that ran fast. "Is it dangerous?" she asked. He looked at her. "It might be." "Will you be careful?" "Yes." "Promise?" He held her gaze. "I promise I will do everything I can to come home to you. That's the most honest answer I can give you." Sophie chewed on that. Then she said, "Okay," in the tone she used when she'd accepted something she didn't entirely like, which was honest of her, and he appreciated it. She picked up her fork. "The pasta smells done." It was. He drained it, and they ate, and she made him watch 15 minutes of her cartoon afterward, which he did, and when he put her to bed at 9 o'clock, she grabbed his hand and held it for a moment before letting go. He went back to the kitchen after she fell asleep. On the table was a piece of paper he'd been avoiding since getting home. Voss had given it to him at the end of the briefing, a summary of what the forensic team had recovered from the Sterling Dynamics Security Archive, specifically the archived footage from the executive floors in the weeks before the kidnapping. The footage itself was being analyzed, but the metadata had yielded something. The camera system had been accessed remotely 17 times over the past month. Each access had lasted between 4 and 9 minutes. Each access had occurred during off-peak hours when building security wasn't actively monitoring, and each access had originated from an IP address that traced back to a device registered to Sterling Dynamics' internal network. The device was assigned to Connor Blake. He'd been walking the building's security architecture from his own desk, learning it, identifying the weak points, passing that information to someone outside. And he'd done it while coming to work every day in a pressed suit, reviewing operational reports, shaking hands in board meetings, being the person everyone assumed was doing the right things for the right reasons. Ethan had spent enough time in environments where people maintained covers to understand that it required a specific kind of commitment, a willingness to sustain a performance across every interaction, every casual conversation, every moment when the gap between who you actually were and who you were pretending to be had the potential to show. It was exhausting work. The people who were best at it were often the ones who'd started so long ago they'd half convinced themselves the performance was real. He wondered if Blake had done that. If he'd stood in that executive suite and looked out at the city and felt something like legitimacy, some part of him that had decided the version of himself in the suit was the real one, and the version siphoning company funds through shell companies was the aberration. Probably not. That was a comfortable thing to believe about people who did this kind of thing, but in his experience it was usually wrong. Usually they just didn't care very much about the people on the other side of the damage. That was the simpler answer and the more accurate one. He folded the paper and put it in the folder. Then he went to the closet and pulled out a bag he kept packed with basics. It was an old habit from his service years, the kind that felt ridiculous in a civilian apartment, and yet he'd never fully stopped maintaining it. He added a few things, set the bag by the door. He went back to the bedroom and stood at the closet and looked at the box still sitting open on the counter where he'd left it. The photograph was the thing he'd been not looking at all day. He picked it up now. 5 men in tactical gear. The light was the bleached, flat light of late afternoon in a dry climate, and everyone in the picture had the particular expression of people who are tired in a specific way that only certain work produces. Not sleepy, not beaten, but wrung out from the inside and still present, still square in the frame because being present was the job. He was the one on the left, 29 years old in this picture. A version of himself so remote it was almost academic. The man on the far right was Danny Osei. The man in the middle was Joel Fraser. They were the two who hadn't come out of Cross Harbor. He looked at them for a while. He thought about the investigation that had closed without resolution, about Hunter Davis's name in a file that said probable but unconfirmed, about 8 years of carrying the weight of that word, unconfirmed, and all the things it left open. Whether he'd missed something he should have caught, whether a different call at a different moment might have changed the ending, whether the information they'd been given had already been compromised when he'd signed off on it, and whether he should have pushed harder to verify it, one more level, one more check. The thing about that kind of guilt was that it had very good arguments. It could always point to the moment, the decision, the fork, where something different might have happened. It was patient, and it was persistent, and it did not respond well to logic because it wasn't operating on logic. He knew this. Had known it for years, in the abstract way you could know things that didn't change the experience of them. He put the photograph back in the box. He closed the box. He put it back on the shelf, behind the winter jacket, where it lived. I went to bed and lay in the dark for a while, listening to the sounds of the building, the elevator running, a door somewhere, a voice briefly audible, and then not. The ordinary sounds of a building full of people living their lives in proximity to each other without knowing very much about any of it. He slept. Not well, but enough. At 5:47, the alarm went off. He got up. The call came from Foster at 7:15 the next morning. Sophie was eating cereal with the focused efficiency of someone who has discovered that cereal requires very little effort and produces reliable results, and Ethan stepped into the hallway to take the call. "We've confirmed the location," Foster said. "Cell signal from Grant's device. It was off, but the battery wasn't removed immediately, and we got a last ping, Mason Ridge. Building C, which according to your layout is the one with underground corridor access. When do we move?" 48 hours. Voss wants the team assembled and briefed tomorrow. "You're in, Carter. Chow signed off this morning." He leaned against the hallway wall. From the kitchen he could hear Sophie scraping the last of the cereal from the bowl. "One more thing," Foster said. "We ran Davis's name. Fully. Current profile, recent activity." A brief pause. "He's been operating under private security contracting for the last 4 years. His firm has ties to at least 2 other operations we've been looking at separately. And Carter," another pause. "We found a case file. The Cross Harbor investigation. Someone requested it through informal channels 8 months ago." "Who requested it?" "Connor Blake." He stood very still in the hallway. Blake had requested the Cross Harbor file. 8 months ago, around the time he would have been deepening his arrangement with Davis, building the operational relationship that would eventually produce the kidnapping. He'd pulled the file on the failed mission, on Ethan's past, on Hunter Davis's suspected involvement. He'd done his research. He'd found Davis through the back channels that only someone who knew where to look could navigate. And Davis had recognized in Blake's operation an opportunity that was larger than the money, an opportunity to tie up something old, Because if Ethan Carter was connected to this, even tangentially, and if this operation went wrong and Ethan was the one who found out about it, then Davis had exposure. And Davis apparently had decided it was better to draw that exposure into the open where it could be managed than to leave it out there. He knew I was in the building, Ethan said. That's our read, Foster said quietly. We think Davis identified you at some point and flagged it to Blake. It's possible the decision to time the extraction on Ethan Carter's shift, when you'd be the one to find the evidence, was deliberate. To draw me out. Or to discredit you. A janitor with a history connected to a failed military operation showing up to point fingers at the company's COO. If we hadn't already been looking at Blake, your involvement might have read very differently. He thought about Gary at the security desk. I'll send a note to the morning team. About Patrick Holt and his arms crossed over his chest and his careful management of what could be said in front of whom. About the way the building's machinery had been arranged to minimize the weight of anything that came from a man in a gray uniform. It had been planned for him to find it, and planned for him to be dismissed. They hadn't counted on Foster, or on Voss's particular brand of stubborn thoroughness, or on Kowalski walking into a briefing room and saying, well, I'll be damned, in a way that shifted the room's understanding of who they were dealing with. I'll be there tomorrow, Ethan said. 8 a.m. Bring everything. He ended the call and stood in the hallway for another moment. Then he went back to the kitchen. Sophie had finished her cereal and was drawing something on the back of a grocery receipt, a habit she had, drawing on whatever paper was available when a drawing idea arrived and the proper paper wasn't close enough. He sat down across from her. Everything okay? She said, not looking up. Everything's okay. She drew for a few more seconds. Then she slid the receipt across the table to him. It was a small house. Simple, the way her drawings had been simple at 4 and had gotten more detailed since. Windows, a door, something that might have been a garden or might have been a fence. It was hard to tell. And in front of the house, 2 figures. A tall one and a short one, the tall one's hand extended, the short one's hand reaching up to meet it. It's us, she said, matter-of-factly. For when you come back. So you remember what you're coming back to. He looked at the drawing for a long time. I'll keep it, he said. He folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, close to his chest, and left it there for the rest of the day. The convoy left the staging area at 4:10 in the morning, which meant the drive to Mason Ridge would put them on site just before first light. The particular gray window when visibility was improving but the eye hadn't fully adjusted, when the mind was neither fully alert nor fully at rest. Tactical teams called it the advantage hour. Ethan had always thought of it more simply. It was the time when the world hadn't decided yet what kind of day it was going to be. He rode in the second vehicle, a black SUV with federal plates, between Kowalski and an operator named Thresh, who said almost nothing and communicated primarily through a series of economical nods that apparently served him well enough across most situations. Foster was in the lead vehicle with Voss. The plan had been finalized the previous afternoon after 6 hours of briefing, adjustment, counter-briefing, and one significant argument between Ethan and a tactical coordinator named Briggs. Not Carl Briggs from the building, a different Briggs, younger, more certain of himself, about the utility corridor. We don't know it's clear, Briggs had said. If Davis has any engineering background, he'd have identified it. Davis has operational background, Ethan said. He's good at tactical preparation. He's not an engineer, and he wouldn't have had time to pull original construction records from a county database when he was simultaneously managing an active kidnapping operation. He'd have used whatever site assessment he could pull quickly. That's a significant assumption to build an entry route on. Every entry road in that building is an assumption. I'm giving you the one with the best probability of not being covered. Briggs had looked at him with the expression of a man who was technically accepting an argument he personally disagreed with. Voss had ended the discussion by putting the utility corridor on the plan as secondary entry and leaving Ethan assigned to it, with Kowalski and Thresh, which was what Ethan had wanted. Now the city fell away behind them, and the highway opened up into the pre-dawn emptiness of the route north. And Ethan sat with his eyes forward and thought about Mason Ridge's underground layout with the focused, narrow attention that had once been the most natural thing in the world to him and now felt like putting on a coat he'd stored for too long. Familiar in the shape, slightly wrong in the fit. You good? Kowalski said, not looking at him. Yes. You look like you're doing math. I am doing math. Kowalski nodded. That was apparently sufficient. He was quiet for another few miles and then said, without particular emphasis, Danny Osei's kid is in high school now, playing soccer. Ray Jr., Danny's brother, sends updates sometimes. Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. I know. I get them too. Yeah? Ray Jr.'s got my number. Has had it for years. Kowalski absorbed this. You never said. No. Another silence. The highway signs counted down the miles. Thresh, to Ethan's right, appeared to be asleep, or doing a convincing impression of it. Cross Harbor wasn't your fault, Kowalski said. He said it the way you said things you'd been holding for a long time and had finally found the right moment to release. Not gently exactly, but cleanly, like setting something down rather than throwing it. I know that, Ethan said. Do you? I'm working on it, Ethan said, which was more honest than the first answer, and Kowalski seemed to understand the distinction because he nodded once and didn't push it further. The convoy turned off the main highway at exit 44 and followed two-lane roads through the kind of landscape that existed between things. Not farmland exactly, not wilderness, just the broad, indeterminate space of a region that had once been more industrially active and hadn't fully figured out what it was becoming. Mason Ridge appeared on the horizon as a cluster of dark shapes against the lightening sky, low buildings with flat roof lines and the particular silhouette of structures that had been built for function and maintained for nothing. Voss's voice came through the earpiece. Staging position, 2 minutes. They came off the vehicles at a tree line 500 meters from the facility's eastern perimeter. The lead team, 8 operators plus 2 federal agents, split according to the plan. The primary entry teams went left and right toward the main access points. Ethan, Kowalski, and Thresh moved straight toward the fence line and the utility corridor entrance that appeared on the original schematics as a ventilation and maintenance access point, marked with a small rectangle on a diagram page that most people would skip. The fence was chain link, rusted, with one section that had been repaired recently. New wire, different gauge, visible even in low light because the color hadn't had time to match the old metal. Someone had patched a gap. Ethan noted it and moved past it. Whoever had patched it had been keeping people out, or keeping track of which entrance was clean. The utility corridor entrance was a steel door set into a concrete block structure that looked like a transformer housing from any angle except the one where you knew to look for the door. It was padlocked. The padlock was not the original hardware. It was newer, heavier, the kind you used when you actually cared what was behind the door, which told him the corridor was likely clear. If Davis's team had been using it, they wouldn't have locked it from the outside. Kowalski had the bolt cutters. 30 seconds and the padlock was gone. The door opened inward, into darkness, and the smell of concrete and old electrical equipment and the faint metallic overlay of a space that had been sealed for a long time. They went in single file. Ethan first, Kowalski behind, Thresh at the rear pulling the door closed behind them. The flashlights they were using were narrow beam, minimal footprint. Ethan moved them through the dark by the map he'd built in his head from the schematics. Left at the first junction, straight for 40 meters, right at the equipment alcove. Then a long corridor that ran parallel to the main basement level before connecting to the facility's internal stairwells. The math on it was tight. The corridor would put them inside Building C, where the cell ping had placed Amelia, before the primary teams reached their entry points. Which meant if the primary teams drew defensive attention outward, Ethan's team would be moving through the interior in the window that created. That was the plan. Plans had the shelf life of plans. Inside Building C's basement, they heard voices at the junction. Ethan held up one fist, stop, and all 3 of them went still, and the darkness around them became very exact, very detailed. 2 voices, close but not close enough to make out words. Moving, from the sound of it, along the main corridor that ran perpendicular to where they were standing. He held the position for 90 seconds. The voices faded. He checked his watch. The primary teams should be at their entry points in 4 minutes, and moved. The internal stairwell was a concrete shaft, cold, smelling of rust and old paper. They went up 1 level and came out into a corridor that the facility schematic labeled as a secondary processing area, which in practice meant a long hallway with metal doors on both sides and a drop ceiling that had partially collapsed in 2 places. ceiling tiles hanging at angles that created an obstacle course of shadows. The third door on the right had a different kind of hardware, a sliding bolt, heavy duty, mounted on the outside, and underneath the door, barely visible, a thin line of light. Ethan approached it from the side, back to the wall, and listened. Nothing for 3 seconds. Then, from inside, the sound of movement, paper, and then a voice, low, female, talking to itself, or maybe counting, methodical. The voice of someone who had decided not to fall apart and was actively maintaining that decision moment by moment. He slid the bolt. He opened the door. Amelia Grant was in the far corner of the room, and she had positioned herself there deliberately. Ethan registered that first, not the fact of her presence, but the intelligence of her position. Corner to her back, line of sight to the door, both hands visible, and one of them holding a length of metal conduit she'd clearly pulled from the damaged section of wall above her. She had already raised it by the time the door finished opening. He stepped into the light with his hands open and away from his body, which was the correct thing to do when entering a space where the person inside had a weapon and hadn't seen your face yet. "Federal Task Force," he said, keeping his voice low and flat. "My name is Carter. We're here to get you out." She looked at him. Her face was pale, and there was dried blood at her hairline, from something that had happened at some point. He didn't know when. The shoe on the parking structure floor suddenly had more context now, and her jacket was torn at one shoulder. But her eyes were clear and direct and doing the same kind of rapid assessment his were. "ID," she said. He pulled it from his jacket. Foster had arranged a task force credential for him, and held it out at arm's length. She looked at it without lowering the conduit. "Carter," she said. "Ethan Carter." "Yes." Something moved across her face. Not recognition exactly, but the beginning of it. "That name. You work at the building." "Night custodial. Yes." She lowered the conduit, slowly. "You're the one who called the police." "I'm the one who found the van," he said. "We need to move. How mobile are you?" She dropped the conduit and stood up straight, and the straightening itself was its own kind of answer. Deliberate, controlled, the physical language of a person refusing to be more damaged than they actually were. "I'm mobile, my left ankle's swollen, but it holds weight." She crossed the room toward him with a slight but functional limp. "There are 4 men on the main corridor, 2 at the north stairwell, 2 rotating between this level and the one above. Their rotation cycles every 12 minutes. He looked at her. "I counted," she said, without inflection. "I had time." "You have the rotation timing." "I have 6 days worth of it. I also have—" She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and produced a folded set of papers. "I had access to a tablet for 6 hours on the second day. They took it back, but not before I copied the file structure I found on their shared drive. 12 document names, access timestamps, and 4 IP addresses that weren't masked properly." She put the papers in his hand. "I don't know if any of that is useful." He looked at the papers, then at her. "It's useful." "Good." She glanced past him into the corridor. "How do we go?" They moved fast and quiet, Ethan in front, Amelia behind him, Kowalski and Thresh covering the rear. The rotation timing she'd given them held. They reached the stairwell junction with 2 minutes to spare before the next cycle, which was either because she'd counted right, or because the team's rhythm had shifted slightly and they were running early. Either way it worked, and working was what mattered. They were 60 meters from the utility corridor entrance when the primary teams hit the main entry points. The sound of it came through the concrete as a series of thumps, shaped charges on exterior doors, then voices, then the particular percussion of a situation that had gone from silence to controlled chaos in a few seconds. Exactly what the plan called for. What the plan had also anticipated was that Davis's team would redirect toward the primary entry points. What it hadn't fully accounted for was how fast Davis himself would move. He came out of a side corridor 30 meters ahead of them, and he came out running, and he stopped when he saw them with the specific economy of a man who had spent a career making rapid assessments of situations he had not expected. Ethan stopped too. For a moment nothing moved. Hunter Davis was older than the version of him Ethan had carried in his head for 8 years. Heavier in the jaw, some gray in the close-cropped hair, a scar along his left temple that hadn't been there before. He was in tactical gear, compact and functional, and his hands were empty but positioned with the practiced readiness of someone who had many options and was currently selecting between them. He looked at Ethan, and something happened in his expression that was not quite satisfaction, more like the grim recognition of a thing that had been running for a long time finally coming to its natural stop. "Carter," he said. "Davis." Behind Ethan, Kowalski had moved slightly to the left, a positioning decision that covered more of the corridor. Thresh was doing something at the rear that Ethan couldn't fully see but could feel in the change of the air. "You found me," Davis said. "I wasn't looking for you," Ethan said. "I was looking for her." Davis glanced at Amelia, a quick, evaluating look. "She's not worth what you think she is to you." "I don't know her well enough to know what she's worth. I know she's worth getting out of here." Davis looked back at him. "You know what Cross Harbor cost me." "I know what it cost Danny Osei and Joel Fraser," Ethan said. "I know what it cost their families. What it cost you doesn't figure into my math very much." Something tightened in Davis's face. "I made one call, one decision, in a situation where the parameters had already changed. You want to put that on me for the rest of—" "You sold the mission profile," Ethan said. It was the first time he'd said it aloud, to Davis's face, and the flatness of his own voice surprised him slightly. Not the controlled flatness of someone suppressing emotion, just flat. "You sold it, and 2 men died because of it, and you've been managing the exposure ever since. Blake found you because you were findable, because people who've done what you did are always findable by the right people." He paused. "I'm not here to do anything to you, Davis. The people behind me will handle that." "The people behind you," Davis said, and something shifted in his bearing, the selection process concluding. "Right." He moved, not toward Ethan, sideways toward the corridor wall, and his hand went to a panel that Ethan hadn't clocked in the schematic. A utility panel, the kind that controlled systems rather than provided access, and Davis hit something on it with practiced speed. The lights in the corridor went out. Not all at once, a cascade, section by section, the kind of sequence shutdown that indicated manual override rather than a breaker failure, which meant it was planned, which meant Davis had known, or suspected, that someone might come through this way and had set up a fallback. Ethan dropped to one knee in the dark, already moving before the last light died. He heard Kowalski say something short and profane, heard Thresh shift position. Behind him, Amelia had gone silent and still, which was the right call. Movement in complete darkness, without coordination, created problems. "Stay exactly where you are," Ethan said to her, quietly, directionally. "I'm here," she said, from precisely where she'd been standing. "Good." He had the corridor layout in his head. He moved along the wall with one hand trailing the surface, 3 meters toward where Davis had been standing. He heard nothing ahead of him. Davis was either gone or had gone just as still. Then, the sound of a door distant somewhere above them. A stairwell door from the resonance of it. Davis had gone up. Ethan straightened. "Kowalski, north stairwell. Moving. Thresh, stay with her. Copy." He went after Davis. The stairwell was darker than the corridor, if that was possible, and Ethan climbed it by feel and sound, and the map in his head that placed the second level above him in 3 flights and a landing. He heard Davis above him, the footfall of a man moving fast and not trying particularly to conceal it, which meant he was prioritizing speed over silence, which meant he was going somewhere specific rather than trying to evade. The second level of Building C, according to the facility schematic, contained the original facility's control room. Ethan came through the stairwell door onto the second level to find it marginally lighter than below. 2 emergency lights had activated when the main power went down, casting the space in a dim red that was just enough to navigate by. Ahead of him, the control room door was open. He went through it. Davis was at the main panel. The panel was old, decommissioned hardware from the facility's original operation, but someone had added newer equipment to it. A laptop, attached by cables to the facility's internal infrastructure, running software that Ethan didn't need to identify to understand the general purpose of. The laptop screen was the brightest thing in the room. "Step away from it," Ethan said. Davis didn't step away from it. His hands were moving on the keyboard. "You know what this is?" "I know it's not what I'm here for. Step away." "Blake's contingency," Davis said, without stopping what he was doing. He's a paranoid man. He built a dead man switch into the facility's old demolition infrastructure. This place was built with commercial-grade demolition capability for the original industrial operation. Shaped charges in the load-bearing columns, connected to a central trigger. He tapped something. On the laptop screen, a progress bar appeared. If I complete this sequence, the facility comes down. Takes about 4 minutes. Ethan stood very still. You'd go down with it. That was always a possibility I'd accepted. Davis looked at him over his shoulder. The red emergency light did strange things to his face. What I'm asking you is whether you've accepted it. Don't finish that sequence, Ethan said. Cross Harbor, Davis said. Think about what you actually know and what you've assumed. You've spent 8 years building a story that puts me at the center of it. You ever consider you might have the wrong center? I've considered it for 8 years, Ethan said. I've also considered every piece of evidence I found. And here you are. Here I am, Davis agreed, running a sanctioned operation with financial backing from a corporate executive who came to me, not the other way around. Does that sound like someone who sold a mission profile for money? It sounds like someone who's very good at making their choices sound like someone else's fault. Davis turned back to the keyboard. Ethan crossed the room in the time it took Davis to type 4 characters. He got to the laptop before the sequence completed, grabbed Davis's right wrist with one hand and killed the laptop's power with the other, pulling the cable with a single sharp jerk. The progress bar disappeared. Davis went for him with his left hand and they went sideways against the panel, and for the next 30 seconds, the control room contained nothing but the very immediate, very physical argument between two men who were both trained in the same general vocabulary of violence and were both past the point of managing it carefully. Ethan took a strike to the ribs that would hurt more tomorrow than it did now. He put Davis against the wall with enough force to hear the impact, got a grip on his collar, and held him there. Davis didn't fight the hold. He was breathing hard, both of them were, and he looked at Ethan with something that had moved past strategy into something raw. Fraser and Osei, he said, ragged. You think I don't? I think it doesn't matter what you do or don't, Ethan said. That's not mine to judge. That's for other people now. He held the grip until Kowalski came through the door 30 seconds later, and then he stepped back and let Kowalski handle the rest of it. Connor Blake was not at Mason Ridge. That was the thing they discovered when the primary teams had secured the facility and accounted for Davis's 4-man crew and extracted Amelia from the lower-level corridor where Thresh had kept her positioned and calm for 11 minutes while the upper level got resolved. Blake was not there. He'd been running the operation remotely from a location that wasn't Mason Ridge, and the particular distance he'd kept from the physical execution of his plan was either caution or cowardice. Ethan thought probably both, because in his experience those two things more often coexisted than people like to admit. Amelia told them this on the way to the vehicles. She was limping slightly, more than she'd let on in the room, and she was talking in a clear, organized voice that had a slight ragged edge to it, the edge of someone who had been holding it together through will alone and was now very carefully beginning to let that will relax. He called me twice while I was being held, she said. On their phone, not mine. He didn't identify himself, but I knew his voice. He wanted the executive access credentials. Did you give them to him? Foster said. No. Flat. No elaboration needed. He'll know we have the facility now, Voss said. He'll run. He already has, Foster said. We issued the hold order 2 hours ago based on the financial evidence. His passport flagged at the airport at 5:45 this morning. Ethan looked at her. You have him. We have him in a room downtown asking for a lawyer, yes. Foster allowed herself something that was almost a smile. The airport is not as far from everything as people think. Amelia stopped walking. Just for a moment, at the edge of the tree line, where the vehicles were waiting and the sky above them had gone from gray to a pale, undecided blue. She stood there and put one hand against the nearest tree trunk. Not for support exactly, more like she needed something solid for a moment. Just a moment. Nobody said anything. Ethan stood 2 feet away and didn't offer help she hadn't asked for, which was the correct thing to do with someone who'd spent 6 days maintaining control of themselves and would decide for themselves when they were done doing that. After maybe 10 seconds, she straightened and took her hand off the tree. Okay, she said, to no one in particular, to herself maybe. Okay. They walked out. At the federal building, While Amelia was being debriefed in a medical room with an EMT and a federal agent and a cup of coffee that someone had finally thought to bring her, Ethan sat in a hallway on a plastic chair and held a paper cup of water that had gone lukewarm and thought about nothing particularly coherent. Kowalski came and sat next to him. "You're bleeding," Kowalski said. "I know. You should have someone look at that." "I will." "Carter." "I'm fine, Ray." Kowalski leaned back in the plastic chair, which creaked under the weight of him. "Davis is going to have a story about Cross Harbor. He'll trade what he knows for whatever deal he can negotiate. That's fine. It's going to bring a lot of it back up. Officially." "I know." Ethan looked at the lukewarm water. "It should come back up. Officially. The file should be reopened. The investigation should be finished. Danny and Joel deserved that 8 years ago." Kowalski was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "They did." The hallway was the particular kind of institutional quiet that existed in federal buildings at 7 in the morning. Distant phones, a printer somewhere, voices behind doors that were doing the necessary work of processing what had happened into the forms and language and official record that the system required. It was not a glamorous kind of quiet. It was just the sound of things being accounted for. Foster appeared at the end of the hallway and walked toward them. "Grant's asking for you," she said to Ethan. He stood up. His ribs reminded him of the control room sharply. "Which room?" "Follow me." He followed her down the hallway, past 2 closed doors, to a room where Amelia was sitting on the edge of a cot with a bandage at her hairline and a blanket around her shoulders that she hadn't pulled tight, just draped, the way you wore something when someone offered it to you, and refusing seemed more complicated than accepting. The EMT was packing up near the door and left when Ethan came in. He stood inside the door. She looked at him. She looked different than she had in the facility. Not more fragile, but more present, if that made sense. 6 days of survival mode left a particular quality on a person's face, and now that the immediate danger was resolved, some of that was releasing. And underneath it was someone who looked exactly like the person who'd walked late at night through an empty office building, talking quietly into a phone about contracts and trust. "They told me who you are," she said. "What did they tell you?" "Former Navy SEAL, Special Operations, decorated service record." She looked at him steadily. "And that you've been cleaning the 17th floor for 2 years." "Yes." "Why?" It was the simplest possible question, and the only honest answer was equally simple. "My daughter needed a father more than she needed a hero." Amelia looked at him for a long moment. "You found the van in 4 minutes. Less than that. And then you built a financial case against Blake from public records. And then I had a lot of help from people who are better at the official parts of this than I am," he said. She pulled the blanket slightly tighter. "I'd been building a case against Blake for 6 weeks. I thought I was being careful." A pause. "Apparently not careful enough. You were careful enough to put everything on an encrypted drive instead of the company servers. You were careful enough to keep the timeline in your head so you couldn't be pushed into moving too fast." He paused. "And you were careful enough to copy a file structure on a tablet they let you use for 6 hours, and to document the guard rotation, and to keep yourself functional and ready to move when we came through that door." She was quiet. "You weren't rescued," he said. "We just opened the door." Something shifted in her face, subtle, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. Not quite gratitude. More like being accurately seen, which was its own thing. "My ankle needs x-rays," she said, "and I need about 4 hours of real sleep. And then I need to find out what's left of my company and figure out what to do with it." "In that order?" "Approximately." She paused. "The people Blake was stealing from. They weren't abstract. Clients, employees, people who trusted Sterling Dynamics with real things. That doesn't stop mattering because I was the one being held in a room." She looked down at her hands, then back up. "I'm going to need people around me who I can actually trust. The last 8 months have—" She stopped. Started again. "I made some choices about who I trusted that I'm going to be living with for a while." "That's a tomorrow problem," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She looked at him. "Thank you, Carter." He nodded once. It wasn't that the words were insufficient. They were the right words, direct and unperformed. It was just that he didn't have the right answer for them yet. And he'd learned a long time ago that the wrong answer to thank you was worse than no answer at all. He left her to the sleep she needed. In the parking lot, 40 minutes later, waiting for a vehicle that would take him back to the city, he called Linda. "Sophie okay?" he said when she answered. "She's fine. She ate a bowl of cereal and drew 4 pictures and told me the correct way to make a drawbridge, which I didn't know I needed to know." A brief pause. "You okay?" "I'm fine. I'll be home in a few hours." "She asked if you called," Linda said. "I told her you would." "I did." "I know." Another pause. "Come home, Carter." "On my way," he said. He stood in the parking lot while the sky continued lightening and the city he could just see on the southern horizon did the things cities did in early morning, went from a silhouette to a shape to a specific particular collection of buildings and streets and lives going about their business with no knowledge of what had happened 40 miles north. His ribs hurt. His hands had a slight tremor from the adrenaline processing out of his system, the way it always did eventually, no matter how well trained you were. He was tired in the deep way that came from a night of sustained alertness, and he smelled like concrete and old buildings, and the particular smell of a space where something serious had happened. The folded drawing was still in his shirt pocket. He hadn't lost it. He put one hand briefly over his chest, feeling the edge of it through the fabric, and then the vehicle arrived and he got in, and they drove south toward the city, toward the apartment, toward a 7-year-old girl in mismatched socks who was waiting to hear that her father had kept his promise. He had. He was on his way. He slept for 11 hours the night he got home. Not straight through. He woke twice, once at 2 in the morning from something that wasn't quite a nightmare but had the same texture, the red emergency lighting of the control room in Davis's face and the progress bar on the laptop screen, and once at 4:30 for no reason he could identify, just the old alarm clock wiring of his body doing what it had always done. Both times he lay still for a few minutes, listened to the building around him, heard Sophie breathing through the thin wall between their rooms, and went back under. When he finally got up at 9, it was because Sophie had come in and sat on the edge of his bed and was watching him with the patient, slightly judgmental expression of someone who has been awake for 3 hours and cannot understand why other people haven't caught up yet. "You're still sleeping," she said. "I was," he agreed. "It's 9 o'clock." "I know." "That's very late." "Sophie." "What?" "Go make yourself some cereal and give me 10 minutes. She considered this. "Your face looks tired." "My face is tired. 10 minutes." She left. He heard the cabinet open in the kitchen, the particular sound of the cereal box being retrieved, and then the comfortable domestic rattle of a 7-year-old assembling breakfast with the confidence of someone who had done it before and did not require supervision. He lay there for another few minutes just listening to it. The small, reliable sounds of his daughter being alive and fine and completely unaware of everything that had happened 40 miles north while she slept, and felt something in his chest that he couldn't have named precisely, but that sat there warm and heavy and not unpleasant. He got up. I was stiff. The ribs more than he'd expected, plus the shoulder where he'd gone sideways into the panel in the control room, plus the general physical tax of a night that had required the kind of sustained output he hadn't made in years. He moved through the morning carefully, like someone taking inventory of a structure after a storm. Nothing broken. Some damage. Functional. He made eggs with too much cheese and sat across from Sophie while she ate her cereal and told him in detail about everything that had happened with Linda the day before, including an incident involving a houseplant that Linda had apparently been trying to revive for months, and Sophie had diagnosed as requiring a different window, and also an argument Sophie had with herself about whether the moat in her castle drawing should contain water or sand, and she'd ultimately decided water because sand was a desert thing, and the castle was clearly not in a desert. He listened to all of it. He asked the follow-up questions. He did not check his phone. The formal proceedings against Connor Blake and Hunter Davis moved through their early stages over the following weeks, with the particular grinding pace of the legal system working on something complicated, which it was. Multiple jurisdictions, financial crimes layered over the kidnapping charge, the reopening of the Cross Harbor investigation, creating a parallel federal process that intersected with the Blake case in ways that required careful management by people whose entire professional lives were devoted to exactly that kind of careful management. Ethan gave his full testimony on 3 separate occasions. Each time he sat in a room with lawyers and federal investigators and answered questions for hours, and each time he was honest and thorough and did not attempt to manage how the information landed. It was the only way he knew how to do it. You told the truth, and you let the people whose job it was to do something with the truth do their jobs. The Cross Harbor file was officially reopened 12 days after Mason Ridge. Ethan learned about it through Foster, who called him on a Tuesday afternoon while he was at the grocery store with Sophie. She was in the cart, theoretically too old for the cart, but she'd claimed the front child seat as a vantage point for choosing the better of 2 available pasta brands, a responsibility she took seriously. The investigation is officially active again, Foster said. Davis is cooperating. He's implicating the contractor network he was part of. It's bigger than Cross Harbor. But Cross Harbor is in the file, and the evidence you collected over the years is being formally incorporated. What does that mean for the outcome? He said. It means the record is going to be corrected. The finding of unconfirmed external compromise is going to be replaced with something more accurate. A pause. It means Danny Osei's family is going to know what actually happened. He stood in the pasta aisle for a moment. Sophie looked up from her comparative pasta analysis. Dad, are you okay? Yes, he said. And then, because she was 7 and she always knew, give me a second. She gave him a second. She picked the pasta with the blue box, which she'd been leaning toward anyway, and put it in the cart and didn't say anything else, which was its own kind of grace. Thank you, he said to Foster, for all of it. You did most of the work, she said. I found a van, he said. You did the rest. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. We'll argue about the credit distribution another time. He ended the call. Sophie was watching him from the cart seat with those dark, evaluating eyes. Good news? She said. Yeah, he said. I think so. She nodded, satisfied. Can we get the cookie cereal? Absolutely not. That's not a no. It's a no, Sophie. She accepted this with the philosophical resignation of someone who had learned that not every negotiation could be won, and that maintaining your position for the next negotiation mattered more than winning any single one. She turned back to surveying the aisle from her elevated position, and he pushed the cart forward, and the afternoon continued being the ordinary, irreplaceable thing it was. He went back to Sterling Dynamics 3 weeks after Mason Ridge. Not to clean. The circumstances under which he returned were different enough from the ones under which he'd left that walking back through the building's lobby in his gray uniform would have been its own kind of fiction. He went in through the front entrance, which he'd used exactly twice in 2 years, and signed in at the visitor desk, and was taken up to the executive floor by a young assistant who seemed slightly uncertain what category of visitor he fell into, which was fair because the category was genuinely unusual. Amelia's office was different than it looked after hours. During the day it had the texture of active occupation, papers, an open laptop, 2 phones, a whiteboard with something half erased and half written in what he recognized as her handwriting from the folder she'd handed him in the facility corridor. She was standing when he came in, which was not what people usually did when they'd called a meeting, and she came around from behind the desk and extended her hand, and they shook like 2 people who had been through something and were now in the part that came after. Sit down, she said. You want coffee? I'm fine. I'm having some. She poured from a carafe on the sideboard. The ankle was healed, or close enough to it that she moved without any visible compensation. The cut at her hairline had left a small scar that her hair partially covered. She sat in the chair across from him rather than behind the desk, which he registered as a choice. How are you? He said. Better than 3 weeks ago. She held the cup in both hands. Which is not a high bar, but I'll take it. A pause. The board voted last week on the restructuring plan. We're dissolving the subsidiaries Blake used for the shell companies, and we're bringing in an independent compliance team for the next 18 months. She looked at him. We also have a significant gap in our security infrastructure. Not just the technical side, the culture of it. The way the building actually worked, the way people were looked at, or not looked at. What was considered worth paying attention to. I know, he said. I worked there for 2 years. I know you did. She set the coffee down. I want to offer you the position of Director of Security Operations, which would mean building the function from the ground up. Protocols, personnel, culture, The whole thing. She paused. I'm not offering it because you rescued me. I'm offering it because you're the only person I've encountered in the last year who actually understood what was happening in that building when no one else was watching. He looked at her for a moment. He'd thought about this. Had thought about it since Foster first told him Chow had signed off on his involvement. Had felt the outline of it taking shape somewhere in the back of his mind. Not quite believing it was real because he'd learned to be careful about the things you wanted before you knew whether you were actually going to get them. I have conditions, he said. I expected that. I need a schedule that puts my daughter first. There will be mornings I can't be in early, and evenings I have to leave by 6. That's not negotiable. Understood. I want full authority over the security culture, not just the technical infrastructure. That means I need access to conversations about how the building actually operates, maintenance schedules, vendor relationships, everything that's considered too small to put in front of an executive, because that's where the problems live. She nodded slowly. I know that now. And I want the night custodial crew's compensation reviewed. All of them. Linda, Denny, Marcus, the whole team. What they're paid does not reflect what they actually do in that building. Amelia looked at him. Something in her expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. That's what you want to negotiate. That's what I want to ask for, he said. I'm not negotiating. I'm telling you it matters. She was quiet for a moment. Done, she said. All of it. He nodded. Then yes. She extended her hand again. They shook. He told Sophie that night, sitting on the floor of her room while she finished her drawing of the castle. The moat had water in it now, and she'd added a flag on the highest tower, and the drawbridge mechanism had been revised 3 times to improve its structural credibility. I got a new job, he said. She looked up. Not cleaning anymore? Not cleaning anymore. What kind of job? Security? Making sure a building is safe and that people inside it are looked after. She considered this with the gravity she brought to things that mattered. Is it dangerous? Less than what happened last month, more than cleaning. Will you still walk me to school? Yes. Will you still be home for dinner most nights? Most nights, not every night. We'll figure out the other nights. She looked back at her drawing, added a detail to the flag. He couldn't see what. She was bent over it. Then, is it a good job? He thought about the answer. He thought about the building he'd worked in for 2 years, walking its floors in the hours when everyone else was gone, learning its systems and its rhythms and its small, unremarked-upon machinery. He thought about what it meant to know a place well enough to notice when something was wrong in it. He thought about Linda and Marcus and Denny, and about the fact that the people who understood the building best had been the people nobody was paying attention to. Yeah, he said. I think it is. Sophie nodded like that settled it and returned to her castle. The following months had the quality of something recalibrating, finding the new shape of things without announcing it. Ethan started at Sterling Dynamics on a Monday in early January, and his first 2 weeks were largely spent doing what he'd done for 2 years, except with different access and different authority. Walking the building, talking to the people in it, asking questions that senior staff had apparently never been asked before. He had a conversation with Carl Briggs, the facilities supervisor, the man who'd assigned him to the executive floors, that lasted almost 2 hours and covered everything from ventilation schedules to vendor access logs to the specific ways in which certain contractors had been given keys that nobody had tracked carefully enough. Carl was initially guarded, in the way of someone who suspected he was being evaluated rather than consulted, and Ethan spent the first 40 minutes just listening, and eventually Carl realized he wasn't going to be blamed for what he hadn't known, and he opened up, and what he knew was considerable. He had a conversation with Patrick Holt, the corporate security chief who'd stood in the parking structure with his arms crossed and managed what could be said. That conversation was shorter. Holt had already submitted his resignation, effective 30 days after the Blake arrest, and he seemed disinclined to add to whatever official record already existed. Ethan didn't push. The institutional failure that Holt represented was a systemic one, the product of a culture that had decided certain people's observations didn't warrant the same credibility as certain other people's opinions, and correcting that culture was a longer project than any single conversation. He found Denny working a day shift one morning and told him the compensation review had been completed and would appear in the next payroll cycle. Denny stared at him for long enough that it became slightly uncomfortable and then said, "Are you serious?" in a voice that had lost all of its usual ease. "Yes," Ethan said. "Like, actually more money?" Across the night crew. Everyone. Denny sat down on the edge of a supply cart. He was quiet for a moment. "I've been here 2 years and nobody ever—" He stopped. "Man. Okay." He rubbed his face. "Okay. Keep doing what you're doing," Ethan said. "You're good at it." He moved on. Behind him he heard Denny say something, but quietly enough that it wasn't meant to be heard. Marcus heard about the compensation change from Linda and came to find Ethan the following Tuesday on the 14th floor, where Ethan was reviewing the new camera installation with the technical contractor. Marcus waited until the contractor had moved on and then said, without preamble, "You know I beat you at chess the first time we played." "You did," Ethan said, "and then you won every game after that." "Most of them." "All of them." Marcus looked at him steadily. "I always knew you were letting me have that first one." "I was not." "Carter." "I wasn't," Ethan said. "You were better than me that day. I was distracted." Marcus looked at him for a long moment, then made the sound of a man deciding to accept an answer he wasn't entirely sure was true. "You want to play again sometime?" "Yes," Ethan said. "Not letting you win, though." "I'll take my chances," Marcus said, and went back to work. 6 months after Mason Ridge, the Cross Harbor case produced its formal revised finding. Ethan read it in the kitchen at 6:30 in the morning before Sophie was awake, his coffee going cold beside him, the document on his laptop screen. Not dramatic in its language, because official documents never were, but clear in its conclusions. The mission had been compromised by deliberate intelligence manipulation facilitated by Hunter Davis, acting as part of a contractor network with connections to hostile interests. The failure of the original investigation to reach a definitive conclusion was attributed to the inadequacy of the evidence available at the time, a phrasing that was simultaneously true and delicate. The deaths of Specialist Daniel Osei and Specialist Joel Fraser were formally reclassified from operational casualties to casualties of deliberate sabotage. He read that line twice. He sat with it for a long time. The thing about carrying guilt for 8 years was that you developed a relationship with it. It became familiar, and familiar things had weight but also provided a kind of structure. You knew where the edges of it were. You knew how it moved through your days. You knew the moments when it would press harder and the moments when it receded enough that you could go a few hours without its particular gravity. Losing that weight was not, it turned out, simply a relief. It was also a rearrangement. The space where it had been was still there, and it took some time to understand what you were going to do with it. He called Ray Jr., Danny Osei's brother, at 8 o'clock, when he calculated the time zone difference would make it a reasonable hour. Ray Jr. answered on the second ring, and Ethan could tell from the sound of the call that he was outside somewhere, wind in the background, a life in motion. "I saw the finding," Ray Jr. said, before Ethan could say anything. "I got the notification this morning." "I'm sorry it took this long," Ethan said. "Carter." A pause. "Danny's been gone for 8 years. The finding doesn't change that." Another pause. "But it changes what we know about it, and that matters." His voice was steady, the way a person's voice was steady when they'd done a lot of processing before the phone call, and were now in the part where they could speak about it. "My mother wants to know. She asked me to ask you. She wants to know if you're okay." He had to be quiet for a moment. Danny Osei's mother, who had lost her son in an operation that had gone wrong for reasons she hadn't known, and that Ethan had spent 8 years blaming himself for, was asking if Ethan was okay. "Tell her I'm working on it," he said, "and tell her I'm grateful." "She knows," Ray Jr. said. "She's always known." He didn't know what to do with that, so he held it and said he'd be in touch and ended the call, and sat at the kitchen table for another few minutes while the apartment remained quiet around him. Sophie found him there when she came in for breakfast. She didn't say anything at first. She got her cereal, got the milk, sat across from him. Then she looked at him, the way she always looked at him, when she'd already made her assessment and was just waiting for him to catch up. "You okay?" she said. 7 years old, and she'd been asking him that with real diagnostic intent for at least 2 of them. "Better than I've been in a while," he said. And it was true, in the complicated way that true things usually were. Not simple, not complete, but accurate. She nodded and ate her cereal. The security center opening was on a Saturday in late October, which put it far enough into autumn that the light had that quality of clarification it got in fall. Everything more exact, the shadows longer and sharper, the sky a blue that didn't occur in other seasons. Sterling Dynamics had converted 2 floors into a modern security operations hub, with a training center adjacent to it, and the opening was an internal event, not a press thing, not a public event, just the people who worked in the building and some city officials and a representative from the federal task force, which turned out to be Foster, who arrived 15 minutes late in a coat that was slightly too light for the weather and accepted a cup of coffee with the gratitude of someone who had not had time to make their own that morning. Sophie was there because Ethan had told her she could come, and because Linda had offered to keep an eye on her during the formal portion, and because Sophie had requested to attend with the directness of someone who had decided she had standing in this matter. She wore a blue dress she'd selected herself and her good sneakers, which was a compromise they'd reached. Dress for the occasion, comfortable shoes because she had opinions about shoes. And she sat through the short formal program with the engaged patience of a child who was genuinely interested in the proceedings and not just tolerating them. Amelia spoke briefly. She talked about what the company was building, not in the corporate language of official events, but in the language of someone who had spent 6 days in a room thinking about what actually mattered and had come out the other side with a cleaner answer than she'd gone in with. She talked about the people who understood the building best, being the people who'd been invisible inside it. She didn't use Ethan's name at his request, but she didn't obscure what she was talking about either. When the formal portion ended and the room shifted into the looser configuration of a gathering where people were moving around and the coffee table was doing more business, Sophie found Ethan near the window and pulled on his jacket sleeve. "Are you a hero?" she asked. He looked down at her. She was looking up at him with the expression she wore when she was asking a real question rather than a performative one, fully present, fully serious, waiting for an answer that she would actually think about. He crouched down so they were at the same level. "No," he said, "but you helped that lady." "Yes." "And you found out that the bad people were bad." "Other people helped with that part." "But you started it." He thought about the parking structure, about the moved camera and the piece of nylon webbing and the tire marks in the dust. He thought about Gary at the security desk saying, "I'll send a note to the morning team." He thought about the particular experience of being the person in the room whose observations don't register, whose presence doesn't compute, who exists in a category that the people around them have decided doesn't require serious consideration. He had spent 2 years being invisible in that building, and the invisibility, which had felt like a cost, had turned out to be a kind of knowledge, the knowledge of what a place looked like when nobody was performing for it, when the seams showed and the systems ran on habit rather than intention, and the gap between what an institution said it was and what it actually was became visible to anyone patient enough to look. He hadn't planned it that way. He'd gone there to disappear, and what he'd found instead was that you couldn't actually disappear. You just changed what you were visible to. "I was just someone who was paying attention," he told Sophie, "when it mattered." She thought about this with the focused consideration she brought to things that deserved it. "Is that enough?" she said. "Sometimes," he said. "If you do it right, sometimes that's the most important thing there is." She seemed to weigh that, turning it over. Then she leaned forward and hugged him, which she did sometimes without warning and always with her full attention, the complete commitment of a small person who had decided that this was the moment for it. He hugged her back. Over her shoulder he could see the room, the people moving through it, the officials talking to Amelia near the window, Foster standing to one side with her coffee and her slightly too light coat, Marcus in the far corner talking to someone Ethan didn't recognize with the measured confidence of a man who had always known his own value, regardless of whether the institution he worked for had caught up to that knowledge. Linda was near the coffee table, in conversation with 2 women from the day administrative staff, laughing at something with the ease of a person who was entirely comfortable wherever she happened to be standing. Ethan had spent 11 years in a life that was defined by extreme clarity of purpose. The mission, the team, the objective. The cost of that clarity was high, and he'd paid it, and then the clarity had been taken from him in a night that ended in loss and didn't resolve cleanly, no matter how many years he spent trying to resolve it. What he'd found afterward was something quieter and less certain and more complicated, and also, he had come to understand, more honest about what life actually was. Not a series of missions with clear objectives and defined endings. Not a story that moved toward resolution in a straight line. Something more ragged than that, more subject to accident and consequence, and the small, unremarkable decisions that accumulated into who you were before you'd consciously chosen any of it. He had chosen to leave the life that was killing him. He had chosen to be a father over being a soldier. He had chosen to take a night custodial job in a building he had no connection to and show up every night and do the work carefully and pay attention, because those were the things he knew how to do, and they were what Sophie needed him to do, and so he'd done them. And then one night in November, he'd noticed a camera was 3 degrees off its usual angle, and everything had followed from that. You couldn't plan for the moment. You could only be ready for it by being, in all the smaller moments that preceded it, the kind of person who was paying attention. That was the whole thing, he thought. That was the part that nobody advertised because it wasn't dramatic, and it didn't make a good story until after the fact. You showed up, you did the work, you stayed awake when it was easier to tune out, and eventually, because the world was exactly as complicated and broken and full of hidden connections as you suspected it was, that attentiveness would matter in a way you hadn't anticipated and couldn't have predicted. Or maybe it wouldn't. Maybe you just paid attention your whole life and nothing dramatic came of it, and what you got instead was a thorough knowledge of the particular world you moved through and the people in it. That wasn't nothing. That was actually quite a lot. Sophie pulled back from the hug and looked at him. There was something on her face that was too complex to name, love, and the beginning of something more adult than love, some growing understanding of who her father was and what he'd been carrying, assembled from years of small observations and careful listening. "You should probably go talk to people," she said. "It's your party." "It's not my party." "It kind of is." She straightened his jacket collar, which had gotten displaced during the hug, with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who had decided this was her responsibility. "Go." He stood. Amelia was crossing the room toward him. She'd finished with the officials and had her coffee and was navigating the space with the particular directness she brought to everything, moving toward what she'd decided to move toward without a lot of negotiating with herself about it. Foster had spotted him and was making her way over too. Near the window, Kowalski, who'd shown up unannounced 20 minutes into the event and helped himself to 3 cookies from the refreshment table, raised his coffee cup in Ethan's direction in the gesture that served as both greeting and toast. Sophie drifted toward Linda, who welcomed her into the conversation with the natural ease of a woman who always had room. Ethan stood in the center of his own life, imperfect, unresolved in the ways that things stay unresolved, carrying what he was always going to carry, but carrying it differently now. The way you carried something when you'd finally accepted that it was yours and stopped fighting the weight of it. He had not saved anyone heroically. He had noticed what other people walked past. He had refused to be dismissed when dismissal was the path of least resistance. He had been a father first, in every calculation, and he had walked back into the fire when the fire required walking into, and he had come out the other side with his ribs bruised and his hands slightly unsteady, and a small folded drawing still in his jacket pocket because he had not been ready to take it out yet. He thought it would be a long time before he took it out. Maybe he wouldn't. Maybe he'd keep it there until the paper wore through. A small piece of a particular morning in a particular kitchen with a daughter who had pressed it into his hand and said, "This is so, you remember what you're coming back to." He had remembered. He had come back. That was in the end the only part of the story that had ever really mattered to him. Not the mission, not the resolution, not whatever piece of him had been restored by the official record being corrected. Those things mattered, but they were not the weight in his chest when he looked at Sophie talking to Linda with her good sneakers and her blue dress, and her castle with its water moat and its improved drawbridge. That weight was simpler than any of the rest of it. That weight was just love, and it had been there all along, and it was the only thing he had finally come to understand that had never needed him to be anything other than exactly what he was. He walked toward Amelia and Foster, who had arrived at the same point from different directions and were already talking, and he joined them, and the afternoon continued.